the two carrier task forces about to enter battle possessed these strength and weakness factors.
The Allied force had a greater number of dive bombers, 68 to the Japanese 39. The Japanese force had a greater number of torpedo planes, 43 to the Allied 21. The Japanese also had more fighters, 40 to the Allied 32. The Japanese planes lacked self-sealing tanks and armor protection for plane crews. However, their pilots had long combat experience. The Japanese possessed superior aerial torpedoes, and the Allied torpedo planes were slower than those of the Japanese. The Allied force had a greater number of heavy cruisers, 5 to the Japanese 4. The Allied force had a greater number of destroyers, 7 to the Japanese 6. The Allied force had a greater number of anti-aircraft guns, but the Japanese guns were of higher velocity. The Allied force had a greater number of anti-aircraft machine guns. The recent victories at Tulagi and against the Shoho had excellent effect on Allied morale. Japanese morale was affected by a lack of success on the previous day. The Allied ships were equipped with radar and homing devices, while the Japanese lacked this equipment. The Japanese were strengthened by cover of bad weather, while the Allied force was in a clear weather area. The Allied force, owing to the recent combining of TF-11 and TF-17, had no tactical training in maneuvering of a single two-carrier task force. The conclusions as to relative fighting strength indicates that the Allied force had the advantage in anti-aircraft gun defenses, numbers of dive bombers, recent combat success, and technological improvements, with the exception of aerial torpedoes. The Japanese force had the advantage in visibility for attack and defense, combat training of pilots, numbers of fighters and torpedo planes. All other advantages and disadvantages, while important, are not decisive and may be considered to balance one another. After the sinking of the Shoho at 11:35 May 7th, Commander 4th Fleet withdrew the covering force to the northeast. Now without air cover, he interposed this force between TF-17 and the retiring transports of the invasion force. During the night of May 7th-8th, TF-17 left the protective cover of the frontal zone for clear weather, but the Japanese striking force did not. Why was the enemy given this advantage? At that time, the advantage of weather was not fully appreciated. The location of the carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku was the principal concern of CTF-17. He therefore launched a 360-degree dawn search on the 8th to a radius of 200 miles to the north and 150 miles to the south. At 08:38 May 8th, he received a plane contact which put two carriers and two destroyers 185 miles away on bearing 28 degrees true. This was an error, and apparently was the cause of Lexington bombers' failure to locate the enemy. At 09:07, CTF-17 on the Yorktown, who had been OTC, turned over tactical command to Commander Air on the Lexington, who directed both carriers to launch their air groups. The Yorktown air group was the first to take departure. 24 dive bombers, 9 torpedo planes, and 6 fighters. Bombing Squadron 5 sighted the enemy at 10:32. Two carriers, 8 to 10 miles apart, escorted by a battleship or large cruiser, 3 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers or destroyers. The weather was unsettled. At 10:49, bombers were in position to attack, but circled to wait for the slower torpedo planes. The Zuikaku disappeared into a rain squall. The Shokaku started to launch planes. At 10:57, the Yorktown bombers started their coordinated attack on the Shokaku. 6 hits were claimed. This claim was incorrect. Shortly after, the torpedo planes attacked. Their claim of 3 hits was also incorrect. The bombers were attacked by Jap fighters, but the use of convenient cloud cover by the Yorktown planes kept losses at a minimum.
The Lexington launched at 09:25, 10 minutes after the Yorktown. She sent aloft 22 dive bombers, 12 torpedo planes, and 9 fighters. They ran into an overcast extending from 1,000 to 15,000 feet, and the squadrons lost contact. Not locating the enemy, Bomber Squadron 2 flew a box to make contact. It failed to discover the enemy and was forced by fuel shortage to return to the Lexington.
The remainder of the Lexington attack group also flew a box and sighted the enemy. The torpedo attack was launched against an enemy carrier. The time of this attack was approximately 11:40. 5 torpedo and 2 bomb hits were claimed. These claims were incorrect. Japanese sources stated that the Shokaku received 3 direct bomb hits. Regarding the Zuikaku, one Jap observer states she was attacked but not hit. Another that she had not been attacked.
Analysis of all information indicates that the Shokaku was hit probably by 2 bombs from the Yorktown Air Group and by 1 bomb from the Lexington Air Group, and that all torpedoes missed. The Zuikaku escaped damage. While this action was going on, the Japanese counterattack closed on Task Force 17 on a steady bearing of 20 degrees from the time it was picked up on the radar screen at 10:55. At 20 miles, it broke up into 3 groups, not yet intercepted by combat air patrol. The fighter director of Task Force 17 was ineffective, as only 2 planes were able to intercept the attack before it had reached the vicinity of Task Force 17. The commander striking force states his attack group was 10 search planes, 70 attack planes, and 20 fighters. Total, 100 planes. The torpedo plane attack on the Yorktown came slightly before that on the Lexington. As the first 3 torpedoes hit the water, the Yorktown went hard right rudder and increased speed to 30 knots. 5 more torpedoes followed. The attack was not well delivered and was poorly timed. By presenting her stern, the Yorktown avoided damage. When the first torpedo hit the water on her port side, the Lexington's rudder was put to full right. Then, before the ship answered her rudder, the Japanese launched 2 torpedoes on her starboard bow. Her rudder was now put full left. More planes were seen dropping torpedoes on her port beam and quarter. The rudder was again shifted to full right. By this maneuvering, she succeeded in avoiding some torpedoes, but she took 2 hits in her port side. Immediately after the torpedo attack, she was hit by dive bombers, which scored 2 hits and 5 near misses. Because of the after torpedo hit, the Lexington took the 7 to 8 degree list to port, flooding boiler rooms 2, 4, and 6. This list was counteracted, and the ship continued at 25 knots to land and launch planes. The serious damage which resulted from the torpedo hit on the forward gasoline tanks was not immediately apparent.
The anti-aircraft screen for TF-17 was composed of a limited number of ships. Fire support was not adequate. 4 destroyers concentrated in the eastern semicircle of the screen, with 3 widely separated destroyers in the western semicircle. The 5 cruisers were evenly distributed around the carriers on an inner circle. The absence of the firepower of the ships of TG 17.3 was keenly felt. During the Japanese attack, each carrier maneuvered independently of the other. The Yorktown turned initially to the right to avoid torpedoes and continued in a southwesterly direction away from the Lexington, the flagship of the OTC, which remained in the original attack area. TF-17 broke up into 2 groups. 3 cruisers and 3 destroyers accompanied the Yorktown, while 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers remained with the Lexington. No attempt appears to have been made to readjust the screening ships to protect the after semicircle. Through this hole came the majority of the Japanese bombers. Later, the Morris was ordered to close this gap. When the attack ceased, the 2 carriers were 6 miles apart. Although Allied forces claimed a total of about 73 Japanese planes as a result of this action, actually, only 43 Japanese planes were lost in combat. The Yorktown recovered all her planes by 1300. The Lexington by 1414.
At this time, Commander Task Force 17 re-estimated the situation. He considered 2 courses of action. making another air attack, or sending in a night surface attack against the Japanese striking force. However, he had received word from Commander Air that an additional carrier had joined his enemy. Since only about 50 of his planes were operable, he decided against air attack. Fearing an enemy airstrike before dark, he rejected the surface attack also, as he needed anti-aircraft defense. He decided to retire southward to investigate damage to his ships and transfer the serviceable Lexington planes to the Yorktown. Commander Task Force 17 was influenced by the report of that additional enemy carrier. He had believed that there were but 2 enemy carriers and that his planes had damaged only 1, leaving 1 undamaged. This estimate was correct. However, Commander Air's report of an additional carrier meant that there were probably 2 undamaged carriers to contend with. Actually, Task Force 17 was superior in strength. At this time, the undamaged Yorktown had 47 planes operable, whereas the Zuikaku had only 9. This, of course, was unknown to Commander Task Force 17. At 14:15, the Lexington had another internal explosion. At 14:25, she reported fires out of control. At 14:56, she requested assistance. At 17:07, she was directed to abandon ship. At 19:52, she was sunk by 5 torpedoes from the Phelps. 35 planes on deck sank with her. At 10:00, May 11, Commander Task Force 17 received a dispatch from Sinkpak directing him to retire from the Coral Sea area.
To go back to the commander of the Japanese striking force and view the action from the Japanese commander's viewpoint. At 0600, he launched 10 search planes to search the sector 145 degrees true to 235 degrees true, distance 300 miles. At 0700, May 8th, he changed course from north to southwest, where he was joined by heavy cruisers Furutaka and Kinugasa, a welcome addition to his fleet. At 09:15, the striking force launched 70 attack planes and 20 escort fighters. On return, 80% of the pilots reported both Allied carriers sunk. Commander Striking Force reported to Commander 4th Fleet and also to Tokyo he had sunk 2 American carriers. At time of the attack on the striking force, the Shokaku was launching planes. The Zuikaku was closing the range to TF-17 at high speed. The carriers were separated by 10 miles at time of action. Commander Striking Force in the Zuikaku stated he erred in not rejoining Shokaku, as half of his AA defense was with the Zuikaku, which did not need it in the range squad. Separation of these forces was apparently due to the fact that Commander Striking Force thought he had caught the enemy by surprise and discounted the enemy's capability of attacking him. After the Shokaku was hit, she was unable to land planes. Commander Striking Force ordered her to Truk for repairs. This indicates that he was confident that he had sunk the Allied carriers and had command of the immediate sea area. At 1800, he received an order from Commander 4th Fleet to make repairs and proceed to Truk. Why, if the 2 Allied carriers were reported sunk, did Commander 4th Fleet make this decision? It is possible he considered the Zuikaku inadequate with her limited aircraft to protect the Port Moresby invasion force, which invasion he now postponed. It is possible he considered that the Zuikaku and Shokaku were needed for the Midway operation, then impending.
However, this decision did not meet with the approval of Commander Combined Fleet, who ordered annihilation of remaining enemy forces. Commander Combined Fleet's decision was correct. Every commander should maintain the offensive spirit after every action and ensure maximum destruction of every ship if it contributes to the basic strategical plan. When no enemy contacts were made on May 11th, the striking force received orders to leave the area.
The Lexington was lost and the Yorktown slightly damaged. This was more serious to the Allies than the loss of the Shoho and the damaging of the Shokaku was to the Japanese.
TF-17 left the area without further effort to attack, whereas the Japanese conducted a search for 2 days. On basis of carrier loss and damage and the control of the action area, the Battle of the Coral Sea can be classed as a Japanese tactical victory.
But as regards to the overall effects, the Japanese decided that although they still desired to capture Port Moresby, they did not choose to do it by amphibious operations. After their defeat at Midway, they decided on 1 July 1942 to make such attempts by land operations only. Thus, the battle had checked Japanese advances by sea. This was a cardinal objective in the Allied strategical plan. It is possible, also, that when Commander-in-Chief, Combined Fleet, received the report that 2 Allied carriers had been sunk, he decided to expedite the Midway operation and accordingly issued his operation order on May 12th. It is possible, also, that this action prevented the Shokaku and Zuikaku from being in the Battle of Midway. Their presence might have changed the outcome. Based on these facts, the Battle of the Coral Sea was a definite and far-reaching Allied success.
The Battle of the Coral Sea was brought on by the raid on Tokyo April 18th. It caused the Japanese to start offensive operations again and to change their military time schedules.
Lesson: a raid may have strategic consequences far greater than originally contemplated.
The divided American command at the Battle of the Coral Sea had an adverse effect, especially in regard to coordination of air searches. CTF-17 had no control over the land-based air searches, and COMSA Westpac had no control over CTF-17. Lesson: overall command of joint services should be in the hands of the command with paramount interest. This was done by the Japanese, whose forces were under the sole command of Commander 4th Fleet at Rabaul. The Japanese planning was not thorough. The forces were not coordinated, and certain of them were destroyed separately.
Lesson: adequate planning is always a must and is particularly important when a number of task forces or groups are to be coordinated into a common effort.
The Japanese appear to have relied greatly on surprise in all their planning. They appear to have entertained the naive belief they could conduct their operations with complete secrecy.
Lesson: surprise is the injection of the unexpected to create an unfavorable military situation for the enemy. However, it must not be counted on too heavily. There must be sufficient means to ensure success without surprise.
The Japanese apparently endeavored to estimate their course of action solely on the enemy's intentions. They did not allow for important enemy capabilities which might interfere with their plans.
Lesson: it is unwise for a commander to base his plans solely on his conception of enemy's intentions, as often the enemy will do something else. It is wise for a commander to base his plans on those enemy capabilities which may adversely affect his plans and list the more likely before the less likely. In case of doubt, he should give higher priority to those enemy courses which he considers more dangerous to himself.
Weather played a prominent part in this operation and seriously affected the outcome.
Lesson: often the most advantageous position during an air action is for a force to operate within or under the cover of a frontal zone. Commanders should therefore keep themselves informed on the latest weather information and exploit possible advantage.
Searches conducted from land bases and by seaplanes are effective in searching an area when there are a sufficient number of suitable planes and pilots available to accomplish the search, and when the weather permits such searches to be thoroughly done. This was shown in certain areas, notably on the Allied side, in the vicinity of Rabaul, where continuous patrol was maintained from Port Moresby, and on the Japanese side, in the vicinity of the Louisade Archipelago. where a continuous patrol was maintained from Des Moines, Lye, and Rabaul. However, in all other areas, these searches did not appear to be effective, and the lack of definite information finally forced the commanders of the carrier task forces on both sides to use carrier-based planes for search. Lesson: commanders of naval task forces should not place their security on searches made by shore-based planes unless they are confident that such searches are adequate. They must keep this matter under constant study and must make any additional searches which appear necessary as the shore-based searches become less efficient.
Searches from the Tangier at Nomea were designed to cover the area to the southeastern border of Southwest Pack. Thus, when Tulagi fell, the unsearched area between Tulagi and the border of Southwest Pack permitted undetected passage of the striking force into the Coral Sea.
Lesson: area border lines should not be so rigid as to exclude outside friendly forces from operating in the area.
Shore-based aircraft failed to furnish any tactical information and attack support on May 8th.
Lesson: shore-based aircraft and fleet units must be coordinated by intensive training to better support one another's operations.
Each of the 3 large Japanese patrol seaplanes that made contact with TF-17 were promptly intercepted and shot down. This was because they were slow, had insufficient firepower, and were without radar.
Lesson: fast, long-range reconnaissance land planes equipped with long-range radar and adequate armament for self-protection are required to develop and track a contact.
The Allied carrier pilots launched uncoordinated attacks against the enemy in the early days of the Battle of the Coral Sea. They improved markedly during May 7th and 8th.
Lesson: the test of battle is the greatest crucible of war. Even small actions, such as the attack on Tulagi and that on the Shoho, train personnel and improve combat efficiency and morale.
The Yorktown apparently launched her attack groups for each strike mission without designating an officer to take technical command of the group. This resulted in poor coordination and an over-expenditure of ammunition.
Lesson: a flight of planes from one or more carriers should have a designated strike commander to command all participating air units from his task group.
TF-11 and TF-17 fueled in a limited area for 50 hours. An enemy submarine was sighted, but fueling continued.
Lesson: forces vulnerable to submarine attack should change operating areas frequently and radically from day to day.
The tremendous advantages inherent in radar were fully apparent. Certainly, radar gave notice of snoopers and of attacking planes. It guided Allied planes to their bearing and interception. It gave the commander a sense of reasonable security against surprise. It was invaluable. The Japanese, on the other hand, being entirely without radar, were forced to operate with more simple devices. Lesson: forces not equipped with radar have an almost insurmountable handicap to overcome. Every effort should therefore be made to ensure that the commander is not forced into action against an enemy better equipped in technological items.
TF-17's radar advantage was not fully exploited. Combat air patrols were not vectored out to intercept incoming raids until too late.
Lesson: defending fighters should be vectored out immediately. The great speed of aircraft permits no delay between radar detection and interception by protecting fighters.
Recognition and identification of both planes and ships was poor on both sides. These errors caused commanders to make ill-advised decisions.
Lesson: it is imperative that personnel be trained in correct recognition and identification.
Neither the Japanese nor the Allies made any arrangements for replacements of either pilots or planes. With the Japanese, this oversight contributed to their defeat.
Lesson: before any operation, adequate logistical arrangements should be made for the immediate replacement of planes and pilots. Fatigue and repairs must be considered.
Logistics, particularly fuel requirements, are of vital importance in operations of this nature. The Japanese evidently had discovered this fact in their operations to capture the Philippines and the Netherlands Indies. They seem to have well-considered plans for fueling their various units as they proceeded on this operation. In this connection, one oiler was reported with the striking force, and a fueling convoy was with the Port Moresby invasion force.
The Allies, on the other hand, were limited to about one oiler per task force. Lesson: naval units, which have their freedom of action restricted by a limitation in their fuel consumption, may be unable to accomplish adequately their assigned tasks. Therefore, it is essential that every effort be expended to ensure that adequate fuel is available in close by but relatively safe areas for any naval forces engaged in combat operations. This also applies to other logistics requirements, such as ammunition and food.
It was Allied practice in their carrier formations to have the support ships maneuver with the carriers. The Japanese practice appears to have been to station their supporting ships about twice as far from their carriers than the Allies did, and to allow their supporting ships to maneuver independently of the carriers. In this battle, it was difficult to say which method was preferable, maneuver or concentration of gunfire.
Lesson: it is clear that the Japanese believed that their best defense lay in maneuvering, but in doing so, they destroyed their anti-aircraft accuracy.
The Allies believed more in gunfire than maneuvering. They endeavored to keep together as a unit and maintain volume of accurate fire. Anti-aircraft formations should be based on all pertinent factors. Both Allied and Japanese aviators were inclined to exaggerate their claims of damage inflicted. This exaggeration seems to have increased as enemy defenses increased.
Lesson: strong defenses result in less accurate observations on the part of attacking pilots. Commanders should evaluate such observations with caution. There is need for actual proof of damage inflicted by use of photographs taken during and after the attack. Another means of obtaining this information is by the use of a trained observer who is not required to engage in combat. In conclusion, many of the lessons learned in this action appear extremely obvious to us today. It must be remembered, however, that this was the first battle ever waged between carrier task forces. From the lessons learned here, some of which were applied only 1 month later at Midway, came the doctrine and experience needed to form the modern carrier task force.